Morning, dear friends. Welcome. Monday, the 26th of Tammuz, July 25th. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Right now, it's Masechet Shabbat, 18th chapter, and we are on 127b. 127b. A conversation that started out discussing moving boxes, moving items on Shabbos to accommodate a mitzvah, Torah study, or guests. How many boxes? Who can move them? How are they moved? What's more important, the number of trips or the amount of weight? That whole conversation suddenly took a unanticipated, should we call it a right turn? Or whatever it was a sharp turn into a conversation all about comparing, contrasting the virtue of hosting guests to the virtue of Torah study. And we have Rabbi Yochanan and others observing, wow, if you put having guests and Torah study in the same breath, in the same statement, and you will precede the Torah study with having guests, that must be an incredibly important thing. And indeed, the Gemara accepts that premise. Maybe it's more important than Torah study, equal to Torah study, but that led us to quoting a Brisa, then a Mishnah, talking about some uniquely special behaviors, uniquely special mitzvahs that a person could do. What makes them unique is Peiroseihem be'olam hazeh ve'akeren kayemet l'olam haba. These are things that you can do where there is a peirot, there are proceeds, there's produce, there's interest, if you will, that we could enjoy in this world. But the principle, the bulk of the reward remains in Olam Haba. Generally speaking, although it's a complex and broader conversation than the scope of this moment, generally speaking, the understanding is that the predominant reward is in Olam Haba. There are statements in the Gemara that says, Schar b'hai Alma Leka, there is not true reward in this world. And it's a matter of great, vigorous debate in the Gemara and in the Rishonim and throughout Jewish history, the exact balance of Sachar, reward in this world and the world to come. What we do have is specific mitzvahs that we say explicitly there's a reward in this world, but it doesn't deduct from the credit in Olam Haba. And we list a number of items and we compare and contrast them. But one of the items that catches our attention and takes us down a wonderful, or a barrel would say, open a can of worms. I'll say it takes us down a wonderful rabbit hole, although I don't know. Well, anyways, and it's a discussion of the power and the importance of being done, l'kav sechus, judging a person favorably. And so we had the fascinating story of two anonymous individuals, a boss and his hired hand who works for 3 years. He wants to take leave. He wants to collect his paycheck. And the boss has nothing to offer. In the story, at least, the boss does not defend or explain himself. The worker leaves with great disappointment. You could imagine the warm shalom, the welcome back party was canceled once they realized that he wasn't coming with a paycheck. And ultimately, the boss asks the worker if it was possible that he had a positive assessment. Did he conceive of any justifiable reason why the boss would really not have anything to pay him? And he explained all of his justifications, and the boss says, ha'avodah. What you described is not just your wild imagination defending me, but it actually describes a reality that understandably would be hard for me to ask you to believe, and ultimately did. And it ends off with a beautiful blessing of, as you judge favorably, you should be judged favorably. And we closed off yesterday by commenting that based on the Shiltas Terachaya Goin, which is a work from the Gaonic period, described that the two protagonists, the two characters in the story are Rabbi Elazar ben Horkinus, who's known both as a very wealthy man and a great Torah scholar, and his father was one of the wealthiest men in Israel in the pre-Chorban era, and the son, Rabbi Elazar, essentially runs away from home at the age of 25 or 26, and he was in total ignoramus, but he devotes himself entirely, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai takes him under his wing And ultimately, Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus becomes one of the very, very great Torah scholars. Pirkei Avos describes, right? If you put all the sages on one side of the scale and him on the other, he would outweigh them all. And so he becomes a truly great, prolific, and dynamic Jewish leader and Torah scholar. The other poor, the pauper, the worker, the hired hand, Rabbi Akiva, before his Torah career. And from here we see, of course, that Rabbi Akiva had a very special character, even before he embarked on a Torah career. He worked apparently for 3 years. He was not willing to be not paid, but he accepted that his boss had a justifiable reason. He gets his paycheck. Again, where exactly this plugs into the famous stories that we know of him and his wife and their impoverished state, disowned by the father, it's hard to know exactly where this fits in. Maybe this is before he got married. No, it's not going to be before he got married. So it's probably after he got married. So anyways, that's the story. It shows us the noble character of Rabbi Akiva, and it left Beryl very uncomfortable why he didn't just explain outright and say, hey, right now I don't have anything, but believe me, there's a big deal pending. I want to tell you something. As a rabbi, we hear all about big deals pending all the time. So after the people that say, Rabbi, when I win the lottery, I'm going to help every person that ever comes and needs help with their mortgage, or they're going to be homeless. When I win the lottery, I'm going to help everyone. And I dive in that everyone that says that should win the lottery. But in addition to that, many people, wonderful people, have business deals that are pending. And I could tell you, I don't, because I'm bound to keep people's anonymity. And, if I have a conversation, it stays with me. But the number of people who for 20 years, since I'm a yeshiva student coming here, they're talking about the business deal that's pending and the land that they bought. They never saw it. They don't have a deed, but they know it's theirs. And one day it's going to be sold in Bolivia, and they're going to become very wealthy. And there's a container full of antiques from Iraq that are coming over, and it's all going to come to him. And when he gets it, he's going to. Anyways,
you never check your emails for those deals.
And then we have princes and princesses who also invite us to assist them in securing their estates. So, there's all different kinds of wonderful and very, very dependable opportunities to help the community. But to be honest, doesn't this story sound like that? What are the odds? If the guy says he can't pay, he's not paying, something's coming, something's pending. Yeah, he must have spent it all in, in sports betting. So, but Rabbi Akiva didn't do so. He judged him favorably, and that's seen as an incredible virtue, not an easy or default way to see the world. So now we're going to see some additional stories that are along the same lines and will be equally entertaining. Beryl, I anticipate your appreciation for the stories. Alan, did you do some advanced research? Here, you're muted, but don't do the spoiler alert. But as we go through it, we might need your assistance.
Okay.
All right, let's share the screen and let's get started. Thank you for indulging this lengthy intro.
I tried, but I couldn't understand it.
All right, I'll try.
I need you. I still need you.
Okay.
I'll always need you.
That's very sweet. Okay, here we go. Let's open up Rashi, and we're going to keep Ben Yoyada handy. We'll go through the story, and then we'll take a peek at how the Ben Ish Chai explains the story. Taner Rabbanan, another story in a brisa. Maisa b'chasid. Let me just make sure. Yeah, Maisa b'chasid echad. There was a tale of a very, very virtuous, pious person. Rashi, kol heichad amrina Maisa b'chasid echad. Whenever the Talmud, whenever the brisa describes an individual as chasid echad, a certain chasid, although it's very vague, it actually means one of two people. Oy Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, either it means Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, or Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi. Two Tanoim, one who lived in the era before the fall of the Beis HaMikdash. I believe, although I may be wrong, I'm pretty sure Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava lived in the time of Herod. Maybe I'm mixing up him with Baba ben Buta. Yeah, I probably am. So anyways, this is the end of the Second Temple era, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi was a contemporary of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the era of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the fall of Beitar, I believe. So, post and pre-temple falling. These are Tanoim, very virtuous, very righteous. Well, here's the story. As we know, in the time that followed the fall of the Beis Hamikdash, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews, in addition to those that were murdered and killed, many others were sold into slavery. And there was a big effort to try to redeem those from captivity, particularly those that were extremely vulnerable. Interesting how history always seems to repeat itself, because that same phenomenon existed in the 1600s, 1700s, and also in the, well, no, after the Crusades, and then after the more recent massacres of Khmelnytsky and drama in the Ottoman Empire. So, anyways, Shapada Riva Achas Ben Yisbas Yisrael. He redeems a Jewish girl, a Jewish maiden, who was captive, was taken as a captive. Riva, Rashi says Nara, a young girl, a young woman. Vilamolon, when it came to the hotel, Ishkiva Tachas Margiloisav. He had her sleep at the head of his bed. Similar to the language I think we read about Boaz and Ruth, right? She slept at the...
Yeah, there's a difference though. Here it says Tachad Margelotav, and over there was Le Margelotav.
Okay. Yeah. Shkoyach. That's an important diuk. Hold on one second. Limachar, so what happens next is he gets up, Yorad, he goes down, Vitaval, he dunked in the mikvah, Vishon Talmidav, and then he went to teach his students. Let's read the Gemara and then we'll see some of the commentaries. Well, actually, no. In the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Gemara, a person didn't go to the mikvah randomly. They went to the mikvah after having marital relations. Or this, I guess, wouldn't be called marital relations, but relations. There was a seminal emission. There's something called Takanas Ezra. They would go to the mikvah before studying Torah. So the rabbi has a young woman in his room, in his hotel room, sleeping at the foot of his bed. And then he goes to the mikvah, and then he goes to teach. What does that look like? Amar Lahen. So he eventually realizes the students are looking a little awkward. They don't want to look him in the eye. So he says, you noticed that we had a very odd sleeping arrangement. What did you think was going on? What did you suspect? Amarnu, they said to him, you know what we thought? It's possible that you didn't trust the moral fiber of all the students, and you were afraid that if she was not under his immediate hashkacha, someone might do something wrong to her. Rashi, you didn't trust to let her sleep in the common space, and so you made sure to have your eye on her to avoid her from having any kind of unwanted advances. Well, hold on a second. I went to mikvah. That has all the hallmarks of something that should not have happened between me and this young woman. What did you think happened? Amarnu, the students responded, maybe as a result of the tiredness of your journey, you had a seminal or nocturnal emission, and therefore you had to go to the mikveh. Amar Lahem, he responded, Ha'avoda, you guys pegged this in precisely. Just as you judged me favorably and didn't suppose that I sinned with this young woman, Hashem should always judge you, and you should always find yourself being judged favorably. Now, to be quite honest, this is an interesting kind of topic of conversation between a teacher and a students. But I guess the reality was better than the optics. So that is the story. Reb Beryl, how do you feel about this?
It's fine. It's fine.
I think if it were a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, we could ask Alan if he saw the idea. Yeah.
See, Alan?
I'm afraid there might be a seminal emission inside the mikveh.
That should not be happening. I'm sorry. Let's just, before we go on, I just want to take a peek at the Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Yishchai. Look, here's the first point he makes. Obviously, if he felt that one of his students was of absolute rotten moral fiber, then he shouldn't have held on to them as a student.
I'm expecting a therapist.
So he's not saying that he didn't trust them. He just, maybe one of them was still on probation. It was a new student. He was still assessing their moral fiber. Here, so the Ben Yehoyada, who comes from a Kabbalistic and more contemporary society attitude toward this, he explains like this. When he says, when I went to mikvah, what did you think? He didn't suppose that they thought that he actually committed a sin with them. This is his interpretation. The question was, why did this omission happen? Was it a result of impure thoughts? And they said, no, we don't suppose there was any thoughts. We think it had to do with the fatigue of the road. All right, there you have it. A story, a case of someone who was judged favorably and the significance of doing so. Another story. Taner Rabbanan. The sages. I imagine this is talking about the sages of Yavne.
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi.
Before we finish with the first chassid, one would presume he's married, and one would presume his wife would be there.
It doesn't seem like his wife was there. It sounds like he was on a road trip to engage in Pidyon Shavuim. So I don't think that's the case. I may be wrong, but that's my impression. Let me just see if Steinsaltz gives any more historic background to these events, because forget for a moment the details of the story, the Pidyon Shavuim. Again, it's my theory that this is talking about after the Churban, maybe after the fall of Beitar. There was a large number of Jewish captives, but I want to just see if he has anything to add, and no, he does not. All right, let's take a look. Taner Rabbanan, another story. There was an important matter that was needed by the community of Talmidei Chachamim. Again, I believe this is Yavne or something along those lines. And they needed to lobby. Eitzel matronisa achas. They needed to seek assistance from a well-connected matron, a well-connected Roman noblewoman, Shekol Gedoyle Raimi Mitsuyin Atzla, who kept company with all of the elite of Rome. This is obviously a euphemism for a zoina, for a harlot who kept company of all the machers in Rome. I could imagine that's why they needed her help. If she was tight with all of the big players in Rome, and the Jewish people were constantly dealing with different gezerot, takanot, enactments by the Romans, not favorable to the Jewish people. So we would understand why they might want to lobby her to speak to one of her guy friends to sort something out for the Jewish people. Amru mi yelech. This is obviously an awkward and not entirely comfortable trip to make for rabbis. And so who's going to go? Amar lehem Rabbi Yeshua. They decide we got to send Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua was known for his international affairs, and he was frequently a representative of the Jewish people. Maybe he knew the culture and the etiquette. He knew how to converse, and he knew how to make his way around in those circles. And once again, Rabbi Yeshua is selected to represent the Jewish people. Here's what happened.
Rabbi,
Yes.
getting back to the other story, didn't the rabbi look at the other side of sleeping in a room with a young girl? I mean, this is where the whole soita thing is.
Correct.
They could have, and he told the people, he told his students that he was sleeping in the same room with them. They all knew. That was a perfect setup for the whole Soita problem.
Correct. And that's what he was.
That's a mistake, wasn't it?
I don't know if it was a mistake. I would definitely no rabbi should be caught doing such a thing nowadays. That's with absolute certainty.
Sure.
The laws of Yichud don't allow it. We're talking, I mean, I would just say, try to imagine after the Holocaust, and there was this urgent effort to find Jewish children in monasteries, and in that moment, in the moment of chaos and and absolute, things happen that are not standard or normal, but there was a sense of pikuach nefesh. So I would imagine that maybe that was the environment that was going on. There was this urgency. They were running around trying to find any survivors. So it shouldn't happen, but that's what happened. But it's certainly not an acceptable.
There may just not be enough room. There were not enough rooms. It wasn't like a hotel, every place with hundreds of rooms.
Right. There probably weren't rooms. It was probably more dangerous to be, in an unlocked room, let's say, because there was, all different kinds of hazards and trouble. But certainly this is not an ideal arrangement by any stretch of the imagination. And I guess here he didn't even trust the students. Anyways, that's the story. There is a saying, you don't ask a kasha of a maisa. You can't ask a question on a story. But we can ask questions of the story because the stories are being presented to make a point. But the stories unfolded as they did. And it's certainly not a license to emulate this practice with any kind of frequency. But again, I could imagine post-World War II, post-Holocaust, if we're going to, if someone wanted to do research about every rescue effort and every encounter between survivors, their minds were on survival. Their minds were on rebuilding. And so, it's quite plausible that things that happen then don't happen today and shouldn't happen today. But in such a moment, it's understandable that things could have happened.
Rabbi, we have a modern version of that today with Jewish girls that end up with Arabs. They run into Rabbi Adayom Hazeh.
Yeah, there's organizations like Yad La'achim and I think Lev La'achim that make efforts to reach out and to save, because many of these women end up in incredibly abusive situations. So absolutely. And I thought you were going to say, we have like circumstances like the Yazidis in Iraq anyways, let's see the story. So Amru mi elech, who's going to go? Amar lahem Rabbi Yeshua ani elech. Rabbi Yeshua says, listen, this is my expertise. I'll be happy to go. So what happens? Halach Rabbi Yeshua v'talmid Rabbi Yeshua goes along with an entourage of students. And they come to her house. Kivan shegiya lepesach beisa. Take a look carefully at the story and tell me if this doesn't sound suspicious. He arrives to the door. Chalatz tefillah berichok arba amis. He takes off his tefillin 4 amis away from the house. V'nichnas, he goes inside. V'no'al hadeles bifneihem, and the door gets locked. Time passes. Alan, you talked about a soita situation. Achar sheyatza, he walks out. Students, hang on, I got to do something very important. Yarad v'tolo v'shano l'talmidav. He right away runs to a mikveh, and then he teaches. We already know that running to the mikveh usually would be evidence of intimate relations that warranted going to the mikveh. Otherwise, in the middle of a Tuesday, you don't just go running to the mikveh. Amar lahem, he says, hey students, can I hand out a little poll? Can we ask you some questions, a little survey? What did you think was happening when I took off my tefillin? They said, Amarnu, because taking off tefillin is also something that would be a prerequisite in a time where a person wore tefillin all day. If they were going to be intimate, they would have to take off the tefillin. So that could have also been a clue that he was going to do something untoward. Amarnu, the student said, Rebbe, we understood, obviously, you didn't want to bring an item, a holy item like tefillin into an impure place. This is a place where many not great things happen. What did you think when I locked the door? Didn't that seem suspicious? We assumed that you have very discrete national topics to discuss, to provide leverage or whatever on behalf of the Jewish people, and those were matters that cannot be disclosed publicly. Rashi, the door needed to be closed. This was an entirely discrete conversation. And so he takes off his tefillin. That would have been a clue that maybe something that's not becoming of the rabbi would happened. He locks the door. That certainly raises suspicion. But if there was any doubt when he jumped into the mikveh, that should have made them certain that he did something wrong. So they answered, you know what we thought? Shemonitza tzinura mipia al begadav shel Rebbe. We thought that what happened was some spit came out of her mouth while you were talking, landed on your garments, and in the laws of ritual impurity or purity, roik the gazru ala nachrim shiyu kizav l'chol divrayim. Spit from this woman would have the halachic status of a zav. And before studying Torah, you wanted to immediately dunk in a mikveh, not because you did something, but because of some spit from the one. Yes.
He went to the mikveh. For that, he had to remove all his clothes.
Correct.
So how does it correct the situation of spitting on the clothes?
This is a good question. I guess he would have to put his clothing in the mikveh too, or change his clothing. You're asking a very good question. Yeah, it's possible that he would have to put his clothing in the mikveh too.
Mm-hmm.
Today, most of these matters of ritual purity are not practiced. And so even if someone that was ritually impure would spit on a person, they wouldn't go to the mikveh, and we don't find ourselves putting our clothing in the mikveh. But in those days, the practice of halacha was such that he probably would have to also dunk his clothing in the mikveh for them to become tahor.
Sounds very strange.
Indeed, that's why the Gemara is recording it, because this is not a common story. And what's Occam's razor? Dr. Hammer, help me out over here. What do we say? Usually the more plausible and straightforward explanation is the right explanation.
Rabbi, maybe I'm seeing this wrong, but the two stories are in contrast. In one, the students are suspicious. In this case, the students have such a high opinion of Rebbe that they see it this way. Maybe
Beryl, what you're saying is it's not the Gemara, it's a condemnation to how I introduced the story. In the previous story, I said, they were looking at each other, so the teacher decided, but it presents it the same way. It actually doesn't, it just says that the teacher felt like he needed to clarify what happened. So they have the same format of the teacher asking how they might have imagined this could have not been what it looks like. And so here, Amar Lehem Ha'avodah, he says, indeed, that's what happened. As you were favorable in your assessment, even though the more easy, reasonable, and predictable scenario was one that is not entirely in my favor, you chose to have a positive take. And sorry. So that is the story. Now let's take a fast peek at the writings of the Ben Ish Chai, because these are exactly the kind of cases that he likes to talk about and gives a very fascinating take. So join me just for a moment. He asked a question about the chronology. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived later than Rabbi Yeshua. No. Where's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? No, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chanam. Sorry, the second story is Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua lived before the second story. So why does it come first? So he says the second story was less of a chiddush, because in the second story they all knew that he was going to lobby her, and they all knew that there was going to be discrete matters of communal affairs, and so therefore there was less suspicion. So the only reason why the story is brought, says the Ben Yoda, is because it makes a similar case, but it's actually a whole lot easier to give him a favorable assessment in the second story. Let me just see if he gives anything else that adds.
Rabbi, they say over here that it was perhaps her spit got onto his suit.
Well, because they didn't know.
Yeah, so yeah, it could have been that he had an emission also in his pants
I think
and had to wash his pants.
that was a less likely scenario to them. Let's see about the tefillin. So once again, the Ben Yoda is gonna elevate the caliber of the conversation to a more, not esoteric, but to be the chash was not that he sinned, and the justification is that he only was in an awkward situation. He elevates the possibilities. So he says, what does it mean that he took off his film? What were they suspicious? Initially, they were suspicious. This is according to Ben Yoda, that he was going to engage in a kind of banter and a kind of lightheadedness in a manner that lovers might speak, even though he didn't intend to sin, but he would, in order to lobby her, he was going to talk in such a manner. And so they felt that he had to take off his tefillin. And he said, God forbid, the only reason why I took off my tefillin was because of the environment. And then with the locking of the door, here again, and this is kind of reflective of the world and the perspective of the Ben Yoda. But he says, what was the suspicion of going to mikvah? So Alan, you said maybe there was an emission versus a spit. If you thought that I had a negative thought, and that I went to the mikvah to purify the thought, it's chas v'shalom. We don't suspect that, but we knew right away that obviously there was some spittle. Anyways, there's a lot of conversations we can have, but suffice it to say, this is again a story that shows us that, which challenges us to try to presume a most favorable interpretation, even when knowing human nature and knowing the circumstances, the odds are that the scenario is less favorable than it appears. It's a big challenge because all of us in our lives, and that's why I find this Gemara, and I think this Gemara is so highlighted and celebrated and important, is because we're not stupid. And when we see someone doing something, usually we're not wrong or crazy for imagining that it is the worst case. The challenge the Gemara is presenting to us and the ideal circumstance that the Gemara is calling to us to do when it says to be dan lekaf schus or dan es chaver lekaf schus is even when the preponderance of evidence points to something wrong, we should try to imagine what might be the alternative. And then in addition to that, there's another type of dan lekaf schus. There's a dan lekaf schus that assumes the behavior is correct. And then there's another one that says, even if what someone's doing is incorrect, let's try to understand what could have led them to make such a mistake. And that too is something that we're not wired to, because human beings are wired to know our own excuse. Our own excuse is built in, but the other person's excuse is entirely not only not built in, but not known to us, and it's hard, and we're inclined to judge. And it's a challenge. It is a challenge. I don't think it's an easy or simple perspective, but an important virtue in our Jewish tradition.
Rabbi,
Doctor.
Initially, you said that he was chosen, or he stepped forward, but you said he was chosen because he was more knowledgeable of the culture and how to approach the situation. So once people agree to send someone as a shaliach to deal with an issue, you would think that they would have the confidence that, whatever might look a little off, that it's being done appropriately. Because
I had this question too, and I'll tell you what I answered myself, and then you'll tell me if you accept it. I was wondering the same thing. Surely they knew he was sent on an important mission. What I believe happened here is you have the top caliber, you have the top tier of rabbis that were part of the Sanhedrin, and they were having the deliberation, and they chose to send him. And he just told the students, hey, we're going for a field trip once they come to Rome. And so maybe they knew that he was going for something important, but they may have not been the ones that nominated him. Or, sometimes something starts out with good intentions and yet it veers off.
Right.
And, but I think the pshat is probably, as I said, that they weren't part of the process of nominating him. He took them along. And so they knew he was chosen for a mission, but it wasn't like they selected him and now they're being hypocrites by not trusting him. These are students. And also, the nature of students and kids and whatever is, not that they were kids, but the nature of students is probably in a way to be even more judgmental. And, older people live life or some of life and they have more life experience. And so it's easier to have a nuanced or open mind.
Rabbi, young people have different hormones.
That's also true. So young people might be projecting their own desires or imagination.
They couldn't imagine maybe what really happened.
But you know what? Our tradition teaches us that a person should never be too confident or. But anyway, we'll stop over here. Because we've already. All right. Remember, I'm thinking of a Gemara we had a few months ago. But anyways, okay. Let's try to jump into the next Gemara, and we'll probably have to pick this up tomorrow. So now we have to totally transport ourselves back to another world, a world that's describing a room full of baskets of grain or stuff, and you need to clear it out for a purpose of a mitzvah on Shabbos, and it's tircha, it's heavy lifting, and the Chazal ideally would like us to limit the tircha unless it's necessary.
Now, Rabbi, I'd like to for a second go back to the issue of Hevek Dan Kol Adam Mikaf Zchut.
Yes.
I see it as interesting. It doesn't say Hevek Dan Chavercha Mikaf Zchut. It's Kol Adam. If you have a chaver, you know him. You're familiar. You know his habits. You know he's what kind of person he is. So it's easier to be done a chaver Mikaf Zchut, but it's harder to judge Kol Adam Mikaf Zchut. Here, however, in the Gemara, the Talmidim knew the Rabbanim. So it's much easier for them here to be, in all the stories, to judge the Rabbanim, the Kavzchos. I would have rather seen stories where it would indicate Dan Kol Adam Kavzchos, just a general, any person.
This is a very good point, a very good question or comment. I don't have an answer for you, but it's a very interesting point to note that the anecdotes here are all of the same society. We could. Well, first the line is the Danet Chavero, right? So you're making a diuk, which is a very good one, a distinction between Danet Chavero or Danet Kol Adam. So in Pirkei Avos, what does it say? Havedon es Kol Adam lekaf zechos.
Right.
Rabbi,
Here it says Havedon es Chaveroi. And indeed, the anecdotes are reflective of that sense. I'll tell you, my instinctive reaction is that the anecdotes that we brought are highly reflective of a Chazal value system.
Rabbi, I think what Menachem is saying, and I would agree, it would be a better story if the roles were reversed. If the student was alone and the Rebbe saw it.
No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that we're talking only about
intra-rabbinic
favorable view. But what if it was a person of a different culture or a different society,
Yeah.
a different background?
So my question would be, if it would be the student, would the Rebbe look at it this way also?
That's interesting too. You know what? I think the Rebbe maybe would try to have a favorable judgment, but the Rebbe's job is also to give them guidance and to be somewhat of the Rebbe has responsibility for the students, whereas the students don't have responsibility. All they have is either judgment or non-judgment. We actually know that based on his answer, he doesn't trust the students, right?
In a sense, he took her to his room, didn't put
And
him
there's a
with them.
difference between judging your neighbor, your fellow favorably, and not locking your door at night, right?
But Rabbi, isn't there a time when you have a proven history, for example, that's negative, a teacher of a student, no good Nick, or the person's a liar, or in other words, and yeah, so out of the 10 times, he does tell the truth once out of 10 times, but it's very difficult when it comes to you with a story. You know, my grandmother died again, you know, that's why I couldn't do my term paper. Whatever, you're in disbelief because I don't know. Isn't it a little bit naive to judge everybody? No, particularly the people you know, and you know who have a history of whatever negative.
I think you're right. I think a person can lose the right to a presumption of innocence by their behavior.
Right. Yeah.
I imagine we're talking here about a neutral situation where the person doesn't have a record that would allow them to lose the presumption of innocence, but their behavior based on awareness of human nature can plausibly be construed as so where it is entirely neutral. But all these questions are actually great points and worthy of further exploration. How far does the Chazal's statement or value of being done the kafschus, how far does it go? Does it only go when it's neutral? Does it go when the person has a record? Does it describe a criminal? Does it describe a person? And when does a person when does it no longer become virtuous to extend a presumption of innocence? And again, we're not talking about a presumption of innocence in the eyes of the law. We're talking about a presumption of innocence in our own self-assessment, which is you can judge a person could have a legal presumption of innocence, but you could judge them however you'd like. Here we're saying that even in your inner sense of judgment. So those are questions I think we're leaving unanswered at this point. But it's interesting. I'm trying to think who would even within the Gemara framework, who would have that kind of discussion. I'm going to try to peek around. If I come up with anything substantial, I'll try to share with you. But again, now for just a moment, let's travel back in time. You have a room full of baskets. You need to clear it out because you want to have a guest or you want to have a study session. And we said in the Mishnah, first the essentials, that you could move them, and then we gave criteria. You know what you're allowed to move? Certain things like grain that has trumas and maasros taken, or pure teruma that belongs to a kohen. So the Gemara says, "Mefanin truma ta'ira." You're allowed to move pure truma. Pshita, isn't it obvious? You're allowed to consume it. If you're allowed to consume it, you're allowed to move it. It's available to you. So the Gemara says, no, it's a chiddush. You know what we're talking about here? The mancha biyad Yisrael. It is currently in an Israelite custody, not a kohen. It's not in a kohen's rishus, it's in a Yisrael's rishus. Yisrael cannot use it. Mahu detema. I might think, being that the Yisrael is not allowed to use or eat or enjoy the truma in any way, it should be muksa, it should be not allowed to be handled. Hamashmalon, the Gemara, the Mishnah teaches us a chiddush, kivon de chazia lekoyin, being that a kohen can eat it, it's not muksa to a kohen. Shapir dummy, it is considered allowed to be moved even for a non-kohen. That's a chiddush. That's a chiddush. Even a Yisrael is allowed to move truma. Obviously, the Yisrael would need to be in a state of tahara. They would need to be not tomei because you're not allowed to be metame. You're not allowed to cause truma to become tomei. But as far as laws of muksa are concerned, as far as laws of Shabbos are concerned, we are saying that one would be permitted to move these items. All right, let's see one more line in the Gemara. Udemai. The Gemara continues and says demai. What demai is produce that we are not sure if truma was ever taken from it. And really,
It's the carmelit of Truma.
maybe, yeah. Yeah. Stingmar asks, demai, you're allowed to move demai. Ha loy chazile. There is no permissible use for these items. Why? Because you cannot eat it or consume it in any way so long as truma and meiser has not been taken. And you're not allowed to take truma and meiser on Shabbos, so it is off limits. Stigmar answers no. Kivan di boy, there is a scenario that a person would be permitted to partake of the demai. How so? Mafkir le nilinichse, a person is able to make their possessions ownerless. They're able to withdraw their ownership by making it hefker. If a person disowns or makes all of his assets publicly available, hefker, now he would be allowed to eat these demai, because the Chazalu said if you don't know the status of grain, you're not allowed to partake of it. They did not extend this prohibition to a pauper, to an ani. An ani is allowed to eat, to consume something that is that its status is uncertain. Rashi. Now it becomes available to the owner. And how do we know that a person that is classified halachically as an ani, who is penniless, can eat it? Mishnah says, one is permitted to feed an ani, a poor person, demai. Rashi, lo yasur alehem. We did not prohibit poor people from consuming them. Here's why. Because a poor person needs to collect alms. To collect alms, you're going to knock on every door. You don't always know if the person you're collecting from is somebody who is presumed in the eyes of halacha to prepare and give truma and meiser or not. In Am Haaretz, in this context, means a person who is presumed to not properly prep their items. Because the preponderance, the majority of Amaratzim, people who are not fully committed to taking to all aspects of Jewish law, we still assume they're going to give tithes to the Levi. Therefore, although the Chazal make a restriction for the average folk, they never extend that to Aniyim, Ve'esachsanya, Demai, and also when a king compels society to provide for the soldiers, they're allowed to eat what's being fed to them, even though there's a chance that some of that stuff has not been prepped. He says, so basically, the Gemara explains, being that there is a pathway to permitting an Am Haaretz, permitting this individual to consume these items. How so? If they disown or they make ownerless all of their assets, and now they have nothing to their name, now they become an ani, and now they would be permitted to eat this grain. Well, being that there is a plausible scenario that they could have it, we allow them to move it even without actually implementing this plausible scenario. This might sound like a stretch, but all that we need in order to allow you to carry it is a stretch, a possibility that you could use it. And so therefore, being conceptually, it can become yours. One would be allowed to move it around if they need the space. My dear friends, this concludes today's session of the Gemara. The bulk of it was devoted to the stories of Dan Shabbos Ch, which provides us some interesting teacher-student dynamics, some history, foreign affairs, and of course, the beautiful discussion about being Dan Shabbos Ch. Some questions remain outstanding. They yet need clarification precisely when we get to the extent, the border, the cases where a person loses credibility. Do we still need to give them the Dan Shabbos Ch? And then we talked about some of the items in the Mishnah the Mishnah asserts can be carried on Shabbos. We talked about truma, even though an Israelite cannot eat it, but a kohen can eat it, so an Israelite can move it. Talked about demai, which for the average Jewish person, the average shomer, the average Orthodox Jew cannot or would not consume it. But there is a scenario if they become entirely penniless, they could consume it. Therefore, there is a pathway towards possibly being able to use it so you can move it for the purposes of clearing a space on Shabbos. My dear friends, this concludes today's Gemara session. Wishing everyone a wonderful day, a healthy, happy, blessed week. Look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow, Be'ezer Hashem, same time, same link. Thank you so very much.
Sure, thanks.